Daniel Cruz's work boots dragged against the cracked sidewalk as he made his way home, each step echoing the exhaustion that had settled deep into his bones. The toolbox slung over his shoulder felt heavier than usual, filled with the weight of another day's small victories that barely scratched the surface of his mounting bills. His calloused hands, stained with paint and flecked with drywall dust, fumbled in his pocket for the crumpled dollar bill he'd been saving all week. The corner bodega's neon sign flickered weakly in the late afternoon light, casting an uncertain glow over the narrow aisles packed with overpriced necessities. Daniel's eyes scanned the shelves, calculating every penny. The apple cost 90 cents. The small bag of chips was $1.10. His fingers tightened around the single bill, the paper soft from wear and worry. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Just this, he said quietly to the clerk, placing a package of cookies on the counter. 95 cents. 5 cents change that felt like a small miracle. The walk to his apartment building seemed shorter with the cookies tucked safely in his jacket pocket. Each step carried him closer to the moment that made every aching muscle worth it. Marisol's face lighting up when he walked through the door. She would be waiting by the window, her small nose pressed against the glass, watching for his familiar silhouette. The building lobby smelled of old carpet and industrial cleaner, its fluorescent lights humming overhead like tired insects. Daniel climbed the stairs slowly, his knees protesting each step. The third-floor hallway stretched before him, doors marked with fading numbers that had witnessed countless stories of struggle and survival. "Papi!" Marisol's voice rang out before he could even turn his key. The door flew open, and she crashed into his legs with the force of 7 years of pure joy. Her dark hair was pulled back in a lopsided ponytail, secured with a rubber band instead of the colorful ties she'd outgrown months ago. "Hey, mi amor," Daniel whispered, kneeling to wrap his arms around her. She smelled like the lavender soap they bought in bulk from the discount store, sweet and clean, despite their worn-down apartment. "How was your day?" "I drew you a picture," she said, tugging his hand toward the small kitchen table where a piece of paper waited. Crayon figures stood hand in hand under a bright yellow sun, a tall man with kind eyes and a little girl with a wide smile. "That's us being happy." Daniel's throat tightened as he studied the drawing, noting how she'd colored his shirt the same faded blue he wore every day. "It's beautiful, mija. The most beautiful thing I've ever seen." He reached into his jacket and pulled out the package of cookies, watching as her eyes widened with surprise and delight. "For me?" "For us to share," he said, though they both knew he would eat only one, maybe two, leaving the rest for her small hands to treasure. "A little something sweet for my sweet girl." Marisol carefully opened the package, treating each cookie like a precious gem. She broke one in half and offered the larger piece to her father, her generosity as natural as breathing. "You first, Papi." As they sat at the wobbly table sharing cookies and stories from their day, Daniel's eyes drifted to the stack of envelopes by the door. The red lettering on the top envelope seemed to burn brighter in the dim light. Final notice. 3 words that had been haunting his sleep for weeks. But Marisol was talking about her friend from school, her hands gesturing wildly as she described their playground adventures, and Daniel forced himself to focus on her voice instead of the growing knot in his stomach. This moment, her laughter, her trust, her absolute faith that tomorrow would bring new wonders, was worth more than any number on any bill. "Can we have story time tonight?" she asked, cookie crumbs decorating her chin. "Of course," Daniel said, brushing the crumbs away with gentle fingers. "What kind of story?" "One about a princess who saves the day," she said without hesitation. "But not with magic, with being smart and kind." Daniel smiled, storing away the image of her hopeful face to carry him through whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Outside, the city hummed with the sounds of rush hour traffic and distant sirens, but inside their small apartment, Love made everything possible, even if only for tonight. The next afternoon brought the kind of coincidence that changes everything, though neither Daniel nor Marisol recognized it at first. They had stopped in the building lobby so Daniel could check the mailboxes, hoping against hope that one of the envelopes might contain good news instead of another demand for money he didn't have. Marisol wandered toward the row of plastic chairs near the window, her backpack sliding off one small shoulder. The lobby was unusually bright, late sunlight streaming through glass that had been cleaned for the first time in months. She was humming softly to herself, a tune she'd learned in music class, when another voice joined in. "I know that song." The voice belonged to a girl about Marisol's age, with neat blonde braids and clothes that still held the crisp lines of recent purchases. "We sang it at my school, too." Amara Bennett had been waiting for her mother to finish a phone call upstairs, her patience wearing thin in the way it does when you're 8 years old and the world moves too slowly. But this girl with the pretty voice and friendly smile was much more interesting than staring at the lobby's peeling paint. "I'm Marisol," she said, offering her name with the easy confidence of childhood. "I live in 3B with my poppy." "I'm Amara. I live in the penthouse with my mom." She said it matter-of-factly, the way children state simple truths without understanding their weight. "Do you want to share my snack?" From her designer backpack, Amara pulled out a container of sliced apples and expensive crackers, the kind Daniel had looked at longingly in the store before choosing the cheaper cookies. Marisol's eyes widened, not with envy, but with the genuine excitement of a child offered an unexpected treat. "Thank you," she said politely, accepting a slice of apple. "These are really good, sweet like candy. My mom gets them from this special store," Amara explained, settling into the chair beside her new friend. "Everything there costs a lot, but she says good food is important for growing brains." Daniel glanced over from the mailboxes, watching his daughter share this simple moment with another child. There was something pure about it, the way they sat together without any of the barriers that adults constructed around differences in circumstance. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Amara's clothes, her confident manner, and even her snack suggested a world far removed from their own. "My poppy works really hard," Marisol was saying, her voice carrying the pride that only a daughter can have for her father. "He fixes things for people and makes them beautiful again." "That's cool," Amara replied, genuinely interested. "My mom does something with buildings. She's always talking on the phone about rent and maintenance and stuff the town's boring." The words hit Daniel like cold water. He found himself listening more intently, though he tried to appear focused on sorting through bills and advertisements. "What does your mom do with buildings?" Marisol asked, her innocent curiosity leading the conversation down a path that would change everything. "She owns them," Amara said simply, breaking off a piece of cracker. "Like she buys them and then people pay her to live there. She says it's called being a landlord, but I think it's weird because she's a lady, not a lord." Marisol giggled at the logic, but Daniel felt his stomach drop. The pieces were clicking together with horrible clarity. Amara's expensive clothes, her casual mention of the penthouse, her mother's business with buildings. "This building too?" Marisol asked, still laughing. "Yeah, my mom owns this whole building. That's why we get to live on the top floor. The view is really pretty from up there. You should come see it sometime." Daniel's hand tightened around the stack of mail, the final notice suddenly feeling like it weighed 1,000 pounds. He turned slowly, looking at the two girls sharing their snack and chatting like old friends, their easy companionship a stark contrast to the complicated reality their parents would soon have to navigate. Marisol caught his eye and waved enthusiastically. "Poppy, this is Amara. She lives upstairs and she's really nice. Can she be my friend?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, innocent and impossible to refuse. Daniel managed to smile and a nod, though his mind was racing. His daughter had just befriended the landlord's child, the same landlord who would soon decide whether they had a home or not. "Of course, Mija," he said softly. "Everyone should have a good friend." But even as he spoke the words, Daniel knew that everything had just become infinitely more complicated. The knock came 3 days later, sharp and professional in its precision. Daniel knew before opening the door that this wasn't a neighbor borrowing sugar or a delivery that had gone astray. He'd been expecting this moment ever since Amara's innocent revelation in the lobby. But knowing something is coming doesn't make it any easier to face. Vanessa Bennett stood in the hallway like a figure from another world, her tailored blazer immaculate despite the building's shabby surroundings, her blonde hair pulled back in a style that spoke of expensive salons and precise schedules. Everything about her radiated success and control, from her leather portfolio to the way she held herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Mr. Cruz, I'm Vanessa Bennett. I believe you know why I'm here." Daniel nodded, stepping aside to let her enter. The contrast between her polished presence and their modest apartment felt stark. Their mismatched furniture and carefully maintained but clearly second-hand belongings suddenly seeming smaller under her gaze.
"Please, sit," he offered, gesturing toward their best chair, a recliner he'd rescued from a curb and painstakingly repaired until it looked almost new. Vanessa remained standing, her business posture intact. "I'll be direct, Mr. Cruz. Your rent is 3 months behind. I've sent multiple notices, and we're now at the point where I need either payment or a concrete plan for resolution." The words hung between them like a wall Daniel couldn't scale. He'd rehearsed this conversation a dozen times in his head, imagining eloquent explanations that might buy him more time. But faced with the reality of Vanessa Bennett, this woman who controlled his family's future with the stroke of a pen, his pride rose up like a shield. "I'm working on it," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. "I've got some jobs lined up, good ones. Just need a little more time." Vanessa's expression softened slightly, and for a moment she looked less like a landlord and more like a person who understood that behind every late payment was a human story. "I appreciate that you're trying, but I'm running a business, not a charity. The building has expenses, maintenance, taxes." Her explanation was interrupted by the sound of rushing footsteps in the hallway, followed by excited voices growing louder as they approached the open door. "Marisol, wait up!" Amara's voice carried clearly as both girls appeared in the doorway, cheeks flushed from running and laughing together. They stopped short when they saw the two adults facing each other in what was clearly a serious conversation. "Mom?" Amara looked between her mother and Daniel with curious eyes. "What are you doing here?" Vanessa's professional composure flickered, the carefully maintained boundary between business and personal suddenly crumbling. "I was just having a conversation with Mr. Cruz." Marisol moved instinctively to her father's side, her small hand finding his with the protective instinct of a child who'd learned to read tension in adult voices. "Is everything okay, Papi?" The question pierced the formal atmosphere like sunshine breaking through storm clouds. Here were their daughters, innocent of the financial complexities and adult anxieties that seemed so important just moments before. Friends who saw only each other's worth, not their parents' bank account balances or business obligations. "Everything's fine, mi amor," he said to Marisol, though his voice carried a weight that contradicted his words. "Mrs. Bennett and I were just talking about grown-up things." Vanessa studied the scene before her. This father who clearly adored his daughter, the modest but clean apartment that spoke of dignity maintained despite difficult circumstances, and most of all, the easy friendship between their children that crossed every line society usually draws. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation another time," she said finally, her tone less formal than before, "when we can discuss all the options available." Daniel nodded, recognizing the reprieve for what it was. "Thank you. I appreciate your time." As Vanessa moved toward the door, Amara tugged on her sleeve. Mom, can Marisol come see our apartment sometime? I told her about the view from our windows. The request hung in the air, innocent and impossible to refuse without explanation. Vanessa looked at her daughter, then at Marisol's hopeful face, and finally at Daniel, who was clearly struggling between wanting to give his daughter this joy and protecting his own pride. "We'll see, sweetheart," she said carefully. "Let's talk about it later." But as she walked away, the sound of the girls' resumed chatter following her down the hall, Vanessa knew that the simple business transaction she'd come to resolve had become something far more complicated and perhaps far more important than collecting overdue rent. The laundry room in the basement smelled of detergent and dampness, its fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows across the rows of ancient washing machines. Daniel fed quarters into the slot with mechanical precision, each coin representing careful calculation, soap or lunch, clean clothes or a small toy for Marisol. The machine hummed to life, and he settled into the plastic chair to wait, his mind replaying the conversation with Vanessa Bennett like a song stuck on repeat. "Rough day, hijo?" The voice belonged to Mr. Alvarez, the elderly man from 2A who seemed to know everyone's troubles before they spoke them aloud. He carried a small basket of clothes, moving with the deliberate care of someone whose bones earned their stiffness through decades of honest work. His weathered face held the kind of wisdom that came from watching life's patterns repeat themselves in endless variations. "I taught school for 43 years, saw a lot of families come
And go, watched kids grow up and have kids of their own. You learn to read the signs when someone's carrying the world on their shoulders." Daniel shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to burden this kind man with problems that felt too heavy to share. Just working through some things. Mr. Alvarez nodded, settling into the chair beside him. "The kind of things that keep a man awake at night, staring at the ceiling and counting problems instead of sheep." The understanding in his voice made Daniel's carefully constructed walls crack just slightly. Something like that. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the rhythm of the washing machines creating a backdrop for thoughts neither man was quite ready to voice. Finally, Mr. Alvarez spoke again, his words carrying the gentle weight of experience. "I ever tell you about 1987? Economy was bad, real bad. I was teaching, but Rosa, my wife, God rest her soul, she got sick, cancer. The medical bills came like vultures, picking at everything we'd saved. I was proud, you understand, proud man from a proud family. Didn't believe in handouts or charity." Daniel found himself listening despite his instinct to deflect. There was something in the old man's tone that suggested this story had a purpose beyond mere conversation. "The school where I'd taught, they had a fund for teachers in trouble. Principal called me in one day, said they wanted to help. I told him no, told him we'd manage fine on our own." Mr. Alvarez paused, his fingers working at an imaginary thread on his sleeve. "Rosa, she was furious with me. Not because we needed the money, she knew that already. She was angry because I was letting my pride decide what was best for our family, instead of letting love make the choice." The words hit Daniel like a gentle slap, recognition flowering in his chest. "What did you do?" "Went back to that principal the next day, hat in hand, and told him we'd be grateful for whatever help they could offer. You know what he said to me? He said, 'Eduardo, you've given this school and these kids 30 years of your life. This isn't charity. This is family, taking care of family.'" Mr. Alvarez turned to face Daniel directly, his eyes sharp despite their years. "Pride is a funny thing, hijo. It can keep a man standing when the world tries to knock him down, but it can also build walls between a father and his child's future. Sometimes the strongest thing a man can do is admit he can't carry everything alone." Daniel felt something tight in his chest beginning to loosen, though his instincts still resisted. "It's not that simple. People talk. They judge. They see a man who can't provide for his family and they think what small minds always think, Mr. Alvarez interrupted gently. But your daughter, she doesn't think about any of that. She thinks about having a roof over her head and a father who loves her enough to swallow his pride when it matters most. The washing machine timer buzzed, signaling the end of the cycle, but neither man moved. Daniel stared at his hands, calloused and stained from honest work that never seemed to be quite enough. "I see how that little girl looks at you," Mr. Alvarez continued, his voice softening. "Like you hung the moon and painted the stars. That's worth more than all the pride in the world. But it's also a responsibility to make sure she keeps that roof to sleep under and that light in her eyes." Daniel's throat tightened. "What if accepting help makes me less in her eyes?" "Mijo," Mr. Alvarez said, standing slowly and placing a weathered hand on Daniel's shoulder, "what makes a man less is letting his daughter suffer when help is offered. What makes a man more is choosing her happiness over his comfort." As they transferred their laundry to the dryers, Mr. Alvarez hummed softly under his breath an old song about resilience and hope. Daniel found himself thinking about Marisol's drawing, the one where they stood together under a bright sun, both of them smiling. Maybe, he thought, there were different kinds of strength, and maybe the strongest walls were the ones you knew when to tear down. The afternoon sun streamed through Marisol's bedroom window, casting dancing shadows across the small space she'd transformed into a magical kingdom using nothing but cardboard boxes, old sheets draped over chairs, created mysterious caves, and every stuffed animal had been assigned an important role in the elaborate story she was weaving for Amara's first visit to apartment 3B. "This is my room," Marisol announced with pride of a tour guide, showing off the world's greatest treasure. "It's not very big, but Papi says the best things come in small packages." Amara stepped inside with genuine wonder, her eyes taking in details that would have been invisible to most adults. The careful way books were arranged by color rather than size, the drawings taped to the wall with obvious care, and the single shelf where a few precious toys were displayed like museum pieces. There was something different about this space, something that made her designer bedroom, with its color-coordinated furniture and abundant toys, suddenly feel empty by comparison. "I love it," Amara said, and meant it completely. "It feels like a real home, not just a place where people sleep." Marisol beamed at the compliment, settling cross-legged on her bed and patting the space beside her. "Want to hear a story? Papi tells the best ones, but I'm getting good at making them up too." As the girls settled in together, Daniel watched from the doorway, his heart doing something complicated in his chest. Marisol was sharing her most treasured possessions, not toys or games, but stories and dreams, and the small rituals that made their life rich, despite its limitations. And Amara was receiving these gifts with the reverence they deserved. "Once upon a time," Marisol began, her voice taking on the cadence she'd learned from countless nights of her father's storytelling. "There was a princess who didn't live in a castle. She lived in a regular building with regular people. But she had the most important treasure of all. She could see the magic in everything." Amara listened with an attention that children rarely gave to anything, drawn into a world where adventure didn't require expensive equipment and happiness wasn't measured by the size of your room. In Marisol's stories, heroes were ordinary people who chose kindness over convenience, and the greatest victories were won through cleverness and heart rather than money or power. "What happened to the princess?" Amara asked when the story reached a natural pause. "She met another princess," Marisol continued, grinning at her new friend, "one who lived up high in a tower, and they discovered that even though their worlds looked different, they both loved the same things: friendship and fairness, and making sure everyone had enough." The story evolved as they talked,
becoming a collaborative creation where both girls contributed details and plot twists. Amara found herself describing adventures she'd never imagined, while Marisol discovered new possibilities in scenarios that stretched beyond her usual experience. From the kitchen, Daniel could hear their laughter mixing with serious discussion about character motivations and story logic. It was the sound of genuine connection, the kind that happened when two people recognized something essential in each other that transcended circumstances. "Your dad seems really nice," Amara said during a quiet moment, her voice carrying a wistfulness that caught Daniel's attention. "Does he always have time to tell you stories?" "Every night," Marisol replied, matter-of-factly. "Even when he's really tired from work, he says stories are food for the brain and heart, and you should never go to bed hungry for either one." Amara absorbed this piece of wisdom with the seriousness of someone who'd never quite understood why bedtime at her house involved expensive books read by nannies rather than the kind of made-up tales that seemed to spring directly from love. "My mom works a lot. She's really smart and important, but sometimes I think she forgets that being 8 is different from being a grown-up." Marisol considered this with the empathy that some children possess in abundance. Maybe she just needs someone to remind her. Grown-ups forget things sometimes, but they're usually pretty good at remembering when someone helps them. The conversation was interrupted by the timer in the kitchen. Daniel's signal that the afternoon snack he'd been preparing was ready. He appeared in the doorway with a plate of sliced apples arranged carefully around a small bowl of peanut butter, the kind of simple presentation that made ordinary food feel special. "For my 2 favorite princesses," he said with a dramatic bow that sent both girls into giggles. As they shared the snack, Amara found herself thinking about the difference between this moment and the elaborate after-school treats she usually experienced alone in their family's spacious apartment. Here, with apple slices and laughter and the warm presence of a father who clearly viewed time with his daughter as the day's greatest privilege, she felt something she hadn't quite realized she'd been missing. "Mr. Cruz," she said suddenly, surprising herself with her boldness, "would you tell us one of your stories? Marisol says you're the best storyteller in the whole world." Daniel's eyes met Marisol's, seeing his own joy reflected in her eager expression. "Well," he said, settling into the chair beside the bed, "I suppose I could tell you about the time 2 princesses discovered that the most powerful magic isn't what you own, but what you choose to share." And as his voice began weaving another tale of courage and kindness, both girls leaned in closer, ready to believe in any world where friendship could overcome every obstacle. The laundromat buzzed with the kind of quiet conversation that happens when people share space but not necessarily trust. Daniel fed coins into the familiar machine, the metallic clinks echoing in the fluorescently lit room where neighbors became temporary allies in the weekly battle against dirty clothes. He'd chosen the late evening shift deliberately, hoping to avoid the crowds and the conversations that seemed to follow him everywhere lately. But privacy was a luxury that apartment buildings rarely afforded, and within minutes of starting his wash, Daniel found himself overhearing fragments of conversation from the cluster of women folding clothes near the window. "We've seen them together all the time now, the little girl and that Bennett child." "Convenient timing, don't you think? Right when he's behind on rent." "Using his daughter to get close to the landlord. Oldest trick in the book." The words hit Daniel like cold water, each syllable confirming his worst fears about how their situation appeared to outsiders. He kept his eyes fixed on the washing machine's hypnotic
cycle. But his ears couldn't shut out the speculation that was apparently making its way through the building's gossip network. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I'm just saying," continued the voice he now recognized as Mrs. Rodriguez from the second floor, "it's awfully convenient that his kid suddenly befriends the landlord's daughter right when eviction notices are going out." Daniel's hands clenched into fists at his sides. The urge to turn around and defend himself, to explain that Marisol's friendship was genuine and had nothing to do with his financial problems, burned in his throat. But he also knew that engaging would only add fuel to rumors that were apparently already spreading like wildfire. "Poor little rich girl probably doesn't even realize she's being used," another voice chimed in. "Kids that age, they don't understand adult motivations." The casual cruelty of the assumption that his daughter was capable of manipulation, that their friendship was anything less than pure, made Daniel's vision blur with anger. But beneath the anger was something worse, the creeping doubt that maybe, from the outside, their situation did look exactly as suspicious as these women were suggesting. 3 floors above, Vanessa Bennett was experiencing her own version of the same doubt. She sat in her home office, supposedly reviewing property management reports, but her mind kept drifting to the conversation she'd had that afternoon with her business partner, Marcus Chen. "I'm just suggesting you be careful," Marcus had said over lunch at their usual restaurant. "Single fathers can be resourceful when they're desperate, and you've got a soft spot for kids that everyone knows about." The words had been delivered with the kind of professional concern that made them impossible to dismiss outright. Marcus wasn't malicious, just practical in the way that successful business people learn to be. But his warning had planted a seed of uncertainty that was now growing in the quiet of his apartment. "Think about it, Vanessa," he'd continued. "What are the odds that his daughter just happens to befriend Amara right when he's facing eviction? It's textbook manipulation." Vanessa had defended the friendship at the time, citing the obvious affection between the girls and Daniel's clear discomfort with the situation. But alone with her thoughts, she found herself analyzing every interaction through a different lens. Had Daniel encouraged the friendship? Was he coaching Marisol on what to say to Amara? The possibility felt toxic, but once introduced, it was impossible to completely ignore. The sound of Amara's laughter from her bedroom provided a counterpoint to these doubts. Her daughter had been happier in the past few weeks than she had been in months, coming home each day with stories about Marisol's latest creative project or the games they'd invented together. There was something authentic about that joy, something that couldn't be manufactured or manipulated. But doubt, once planted, had a way of growing in the dark spaces of uncertainty. The next morning brought an awkward encounter in the building's lobby that crystallized the tension everyone was feeling, but no one was willing to address directly. Daniel was checking his mail when Vanessa emerged from the elevator with Amara, both dressed for what was obviously an expensive shopping trip. "Good morning, Mr. Cruz," Vanessa said, her tone noticeably more formal than it had been during their previous interactions. Daniel nodded politely, acutely aware of the distance in her voice. "Mrs. Bennett." Amara looked between the adults with the sharp instincts of a child who'd learned to read emotional temperature. "Hi, Mr. Cruz. Is Marisol coming down? We're going to get new clothes, and Mom said maybe we could get something for her, too." The offer hung in the air like a challenge, innocent in intent, but loaded with implication. Daniel saw Vanessa's slight stiffening, the way her hand moved protectively to Amara's shoulder, and he understood immediately that whatever trust had been building between them had been poisoned by outside voices. "That's very kind," Daniel said carefully, "but Marisol has everything she needs." The formality of his response clearly confused Amara, who looked between the adults with growing bewilderment. "But I thought, We're friends. Friends share things. Sometimes sharing is more complicated for grown-ups, Vanessa said gently, her words aimed at her daughter but clearly intended for Daniel's ears as well. The message was received. Daniel nodded once, a gesture that acknowledged both the gift Amara had offered and the reality that accepting it would only feed the rumors that were already threatening to destroy something precious. As they left the building, Amara's disappointed voice echoed in the lobby. Why does everything have to be so weird with adults? Kids would just share and be happy about it. Daniel stood alone among the mailboxes, holding bills he couldn't pay, and wondering if the price of protecting his daughter's friendship might be losing it entirely. The burst pipe announced itself at 3 in the morning with a sound like thunder trapped in walls, a violent rushing that sent water cascading through the building's arteries like blood from a severed vein. Daniel woke instantly, the parent's sixth sense that had been honed by years of midnight fevers and childhood fears, immediately recognizing that this was bigger than a leaky faucet or running toilet. Water was already seeping under his apartment door by the time he pulled on clothes and grabbed his toolbox. The hallway resembled a shallow river, with tenants emerging from their apartments in various states of panic and undress. Mrs. Chen from 2C stood ankle-deep in water, clutching her cat and speaking rapidly in Mandarin. The elderly Mr. Kowalski leaned heavily on his walker, staring at the flood with the bewildered expression of someone whose world had shifted overnight. "Where's it coming from?" called Mrs. Rodriguez, her voice sharp with the authority of someone accustomed to taking charge in small crises. Daniel was already moving toward the stairwell, following the sound of rushing water to its source. "Second floor utility room," he called back. "Everyone needs to get to higher ground, now!" In the basement, the situation was worse than he'd feared. A main supply line had ruptured completely, sending pressurized water shooting across the utility room like an angry geyser. The building's ancient electrical panels sparked ominously as water crept toward connections that probably hadn't been installed before safety codes. "Jesus," breathed Tom Nakamura from 4A, who'd followed Daniel downstairs. "Shouldn't we call someone? A plumber? The fire department?" "By the time anyone gets here, half the building will be flooded," Daniel replied, already assessing the problem with the practiced eye of someone who'd spent years solving problems with limited resources and creative thinking. "Help me find the main shutoff. Should be near the water heater." Together they waded through rising water, Daniel's flashlight cutting through the darkness to reveal a maze of pipes and valves that looked like they hadn't been serviced in decades. The shutoff valve was exactly where it should be, but corroded nearly solid from years of neglect. "It's stuck," Tom grunted, throwing his weight against the valve handle. Daniel disappeared into the darkness and returned with a length of pipe that he slipped over the valve handle for leverage. Together, on 3. The valve gave way with a groan that seemed to echo through the entire building, and the thunderous rushing gradually faded to a drip. But the damage was done. Inches of water covered the basement floor, and the building's residents were scattered throughout the upper floors like refugees from their own homes. Upstairs, Daniel found organized chaos. Vanessa Bennett had appeared at some point during the crisis, dressed in jeans and a sweater that suggested she'd left her penthouse in considerable haste. She was coordinating with tenants, taking notes on damage reports and trying to establish who could stay in their apartments and who would need alternative arrangements. "The Kowalskis can't stay in 1B, too much water damage, and with his mobility issues—" "They can stay with us," Mr. Alvarez interrupted quietly. "Rose's sewing room has a daybed. It's not much, but it's dry." Daniel watched the scene unfold with growing respect for how the building's residents were pulling together. These were people who barely spoke to each other in the hallways most days, but crisis had revealed the community that had always existed beneath the surface. "Mr. Cruz," Vanessa's voice cut through his observations. "Tom said you shut off the water. Thank you." There was something different in her tone. Not the careful formality of their recent interactions, but genuine gratitude, mixed with something that might have been recognition. "Still need to deal with the electrical," Daniel replied, already mentally cataloging what needed to be done. "That panel took on water and some of the circuits are probably compromised. Buildings shouldn't have power until everything's checked." Vanessa looked around at the displaced tenants, elderly residents who couldn't climb stairs easily, families with young children who needed stability. "How long will that take?"
Done right, days, maybe a week. Daniel met her eyes directly for the first time in weeks. Done fast so people can get back to their lives, I could have temporary power restored by tomorrow night. Safe temporary power, he added quickly. Nothing that would put anyone at risk. The unspoken understanding passed between them. Daniel had skills the building needed, expertise that couldn't be bought or outsourced in the middle of a crisis, and Vanessa had the authority to let him work. "What do you need?" she asked simply. "Access to the electrical room, $300 in parts, and 12 hours. Daniel's voice was steady, professional. This wasn't about their personal situation or his overdue rent. This was about neighbors helping neighbors when everything else fell apart. Vanessa nodded. Done.
As Daniel headed back to the basement with his toolbox and a renewed sense of purpose, he didn't notice Amara and Marisol watching from the second-floor landing. The girls had found each other in the chaos and now stood hand in hand, witnessing their parents work together for the first time. "Your dad's really good at fixing things," Amara whispered. "He says broken things just need someone who cares enough to make them work again," Marisol replied, watching her father disappear into the darkness below. Neither girl understood the full significance of what they were witnessing, but they both sensed that something important was shifting in the water-damaged building they called home. The eviction notice felt heavier than paper had any right to be, its legal language wrapping around Daniel's throat like a noose. Final notice, 30 days to vacate. The words blurred as exhaustion and desperation finally overwhelmed the pride that had been holding him together for months. Daniel sat at their small kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, surrounded by bills he couldn't pay and job estimates that wouldn't cover half of what they owed. The building crisis had earned him temporary goodwill and a small payment for the electrical work, but it wasn't enough. Wouldn't ever be enough to dig them out of the hole that kept getting deeper no matter how hard he worked. The apartment was silent except for Marisol's soft breathing from her bedroom and the building's familiar nighttime sounds, pipes settling, neighbors moving around above them, the distant hum of traffic that never quite stopped in the city. Soon, these sounds would belong to someone else's life, and he would have to explain to his daughter why they were packing everything they owned into garbage bags again. He'd been here before. In the months after Maria's death, when the medical bills had consumed their savings and the grief had made it impossible to focus on work. That time they'd moved in with his sister for 6 months, sleeping on a couch that smelled like other people's lives, while Marisol asked him every night when they could go home. He'd sworn then that he would never put her through that again. But swearing and achieving were different things, and now he was staring at the evidence of his failure in bold legal print. "Poppy," Marisol's voice came from the hallway, small and uncertain in the darkness. "Why are you awake?" Daniel quickly shuffled the papers into a pile, trying to hide the notice under utility bills and credit card statements. "Just couldn't sleep, mi amor. Go back to bed." But Marisol had inherited her father's stubborn streak, and she padded into the kitchen on bare feet, her hair mussed from sleep. "Are you worried about something?" The question was asked with the kind of directness that only children possessed, cutting through adult pretense to the heart of truth. Daniel looked at his daughter, 7 years old and too perceptive for her own good, and felt something inside him break. "A little worried," he admitted, pulling her onto his lap. "Nothing for you to think about." Marisol studied his face with the intensity of someone who learned to read emotions in the absence of explanations. "Is it about money again?" The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Again. She remembered the other times, the hushed phone calls and late-night conversations he thought were private. She'd been watching and learning and understanding more than any child should have to. "Sometimes daddies have to make difficult decisions," he said carefully, his arms tightening around her small frame. "But I promise you'll always be safe and loved, no matter what." Marisol was quiet for a long moment, and Daniel could almost hear her processing this information with the seriousness of someone far older than her years. "Are we going to have to move away from Amara?" The question shattered what remained of Daniel's composure. Not, "Are we going to move?" but specifically away from the friendship that had become the brightest part of her world. She'd been listening more carefully than he had realized, connecting dots that he'd hoped would remain invisible. "I don't know, baby," he whispered, the admission feeling like surrender. "I'm trying very hard to make sure we don't have to." "But if we do," said Marisol with the kind of logic that could only come from innocence, "then maybe Mrs. Bennet would help us. She's nice, and she likes you because you fixed the building when it was broken." Daniel's heart clenched. Even now at 7 years old, his daughter was trying to solve problems that weren't hers to carry. "It's not that simple, mija." "Why not? When people are friends, they help each other. That's what you always tell me." The truth was so stark, so undeniable in its childish clarity, that Daniel couldn't find words to argue with it. His pride, his fear of judgment, his desperate need to prove he could handle everything alone, none of it made sense when viewed through the lens of a child who saw only the possibility of help offered and received with love.
But before he could respond, Marisol slipped from his lap and padded back toward her room. At the doorway, she turned back with a sleepy smile. "I love you, Poppy. Everything's going to be okay." Alone again in the darkness, Daniel stared at the eviction notice until the legal language blurred into meaningless shapes. His daughter's faith in happy endings felt both precious and heartbreaking, a reminder of what he was fighting to preserve and what he was afraid he'd already lost. Outside, the city was beginning to wake up. Early commuters heading to jobs that paid enough to cover rent, delivery trucks bringing supplies to businesses that thrived instead of merely survived. Somewhere in this building, Vanessa Bennet was probably sleeping peacefully in a bed that had never known the weight of impossible choices. But here, in apartment 3B, a father sat alone, with his failures spread across a table like evidence in a trial where the verdict had already been decided. And for the first time since Maria's death, Daniel wondered if love alone was enough to keep his daughter's world from falling apart. The eviction notice seemed to pulse in the dim light, a countdown to the moment when he would have to choose between his pride and his promise to never let Marisol suffer for his shortcomings again. Daniel climbed the stairs to the penthouse slowly, each step feeling like a surrender he'd spent months avoiding. The eviction notice was folded in his pocket, its presence burning like shame against his leg. 3 days. That's how long he had left before the sheriff would come with legal papers and the kind of finality that couldn't be negotiated or delayed. The hallway leading to Vanessa's apartment was different from the rest of the building. Newer carpet, fresh paint, the kind of maintenance that money made possible. Daniel stood before her door for a full minute, his raised hand hovering inches from the wood as pride and desperation waged their final battle in his chest. The knock, when it finally came, was soft and uncertain. "Mr. Cruz." Vanessa's surprise was evident as she opened the door, taking in his appearance, work clothes clean but worn, shoulders squared with the effort of a man forcing himself to stand straight under impossible weight. "Is everything all right? Is there another problem with the building?" "No, ma'am," Daniel said quietly. "I was hoping we could talk about the rent situation." Something in his voice, the absence of his usual defensive edge perhaps, or the way he couldn't quite meet her eyes, made Vanessa step aside immediately. "Of course. Please come in." The penthouse apartment opened before him like a window into another world. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that transformed urban chaos into something approaching art. The furniture was expensive but comfortable, chosen by someone who understood the difference between cost and value. This was what money looked like when it was earned rather than inherited, successful but not ostentatious. "Can I get you coffee, water?" Vanessa asked, her business instincts warring with the growing certainty that this conversation was about more than late rent. "I'm listening." The words came slowly at first, like water through a crack in a dam. Daniel told her about Maria's illness, the medical bills that had consumed their savings, the construction layoffs that happened just when they needed stability most. He spoke about the odd jobs that paid too little too late, about lying awake at night calculating how to make $40 stretch across a week's worth of necessities. "I've never been the kind of man who asks for help," he said, his voice steady, despite the cost of each admission, raised to believe that a real man provides for his family, no matter what. "But I'm not providing. I'm failing, and my daughter is going to pay the price for my pride." Vanessa listened without interruption, watching this man she'd categorized as simply a problem tenant reveal himself as something far more complex. His love for Marisol was evident in every word, his frustration with his circumstances palpable but never self-pitying. "The friendship between our daughters," Daniel continued, "it wasn't planned, wasn't some scheme to get close to you or manipulate the situation. Marisol she makes friends the way flowers grow toward sunlight, natural and honest, and without any agenda beyond wanting to connect with someone who makes her laugh." "I know," Vanessa said quietly. "I've watched them together. There's nothing calculated about what they share." Daniel's shoulders sagged slightly with relief. "I've been afraid that accepting anything from you would make you think that you're taking advantage." Vanessa finished the thought, understanding suddenly flooding through her. "The building gossip. I've heard some of it too." They sat in silence for a moment, both acknowledging the weight of others' judgments and the way suspicion could poison even genuine gesture.
Were lessons he'd tried to teach her, but they'd been reinforced by watching adults around her make similar choices in real situations. The building manager position had evolved beyond what either Daniel or Vanessa had initially envisioned. What had started as a practical solution to his rent problem had become something more meaningful, a role that combined his technical skills with his natural inclination to help solve problems before they became crises. Tenants brought him everything from leaky pipes to neighbor disputes, trusting him to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. "Daniel, there you are!" Mr. Alvarez appeared at the top of the stairs, moving with the careful precision of someone whose body required patience but whose mind remained sharp as ever. "I wanted to thank you for helping Mr. Kowalski with his mobility ramp yesterday. Makes all the difference for someone with his walker." "Happy to help," Daniel replied, meaning it completely. The ramp had been his suggestion, a simple modification that transformed the building's front steps into an accommodation. "Actually thinking we should look into a few more accessibility improvements, maybe grab rails in some of the bathroom areas." Mr. Alvarez nodded approvingly. "You've got a good eye for what people need before they know they need it. That's a rare gift." The observation settled warmly in Daniel's chest. For so long, his identity had been tied to what he couldn't provide, what he couldn't afford, what he couldn't fix about his own circumstances. Now he was discovering that his value lay not in perfection, but in his willingness to notice problems and work towards solutions. From the penthouse, Vanessa watched the morning routine of her building with satisfaction that went beyond mere property management. The investment in Daniel as building manager had paid dividends she hadn't anticipated, not just in maintenance quality and tenant satisfaction, but in the sense of community that had emerged under his quiet leadership. "Mom, can we have pancakes?" Amara asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway, with the kind of bedhead that suggested she'd been sleeping deeply and dreaming well. "Marisol's coming up for breakfast, and I promised her we'd make the kind with blueberries." "Of course," Vanessa replied, already reaching for the mixing bowl. Weekend breakfasts had become a tradition that neither she nor Amara questioned anymore, an extension of friendship that had grown naturally from the girls' bond into something that included their parents. 20 minutes later, the penthouse kitchen buzzed with the comfortable chaos of family breakfast expanded to include chosen family. Marisol perched on a stool beside Amara, both girls taking turns stirring batter with the serious concentration of sous chefs assisting in a masterclass. "Papi's fixing the Nakamura's shower today," Marisol announced to Vanessa, with the pride of someone reporting important news. "He says the old one was wasting water, but the new one will be better for the environment and their water bill." "Your father thinks about everything," Vanessa replied, catching Daniel's eye across the kitchen with a look that conveyed appreciation for both his thoroughness and his daughter's obvious admiration. "Just part of the job," Daniel smiled, his cheeks warming slightly, still adjusting to praise that came without strings attached,
or expectations beyond competent work. No, Amara corrected him with the directness that only children could manage. It's part of caring about people. That's different. The observation hung in the air, simple and profound in the way that truth often was when delivered without pretense. Daniel found himself thinking about the man he'd been 6 months ago, proud to the point of isolation, so focused on maintaining independence that he nearly lost everything that mattered. "Speaking of caring about people," Vanessa said, pulling a letter from her robe pocket, "I got something interesting in yesterday's mail. A letter from the city's housing authority." Daniel's stomach clenched reflexively, old fears rising before rational thought could intervene. Letters from official sources still triggered the fight-or-flight response that months of security hadn't completely erased. "Good news," the Nefa continued quickly, recognizing his reaction. "They're looking for property managers to participate in a pilot program, affordable housing initiatives with incentives for buildings that demonstrate strong community integration and tenant satisfaction." She handed him the letter, watching as he read through the details with growing interest. The program offered grants for accessibility improvements, energy efficiency upgrades, and community development projects. But more importantly, it recognized buildings like ours as models for how housing could be about more than just shelter. "They want to feature us as a case study," Daniel said, looking up from the letter with something approaching amazement. "The building, the community programs, the way residents support each other. The way one person's vision for how things could be different actually made them different," Vanessa added quietly. Daniel shook his head, deflecting the praise even as he felt its warmth. "Wasn't my vision. Was just necessity, and people being decent to each other when it mattered."
"I don't have the money for rent," Daniel said finally, the words coming out like a confession. "Won't have it by Friday. I've been working every job I can find, but it's not enough. 3 months behind, and now they're saying I have to vacate." Vanessa felt something tighten in her chest as she watched this proud man strip away every defense he'd built around his situation. "What are you asking me for, Mr. Cruz?" "Time," he said simply. "A chance to work off what I owe instead of just promising to pay it someday. I saw how you looked at the electrical work I did during the flood. You know I'm good at what I do. The building needs maintenance, repairs, improvements. Let me earn our place here instead of begging for it." The proposal hung between them, practical and dignified in equal measure. Vanessa found herself thinking about Amara's recent happiness, about the way her daughter talked about Marisol's father, with the kind of respect children rarely showed adults outside their family. "The building manager position," she said, slowly, thinking out loud. "It's been vacant for months. I've been handling everything myself, but with 6 properties now." Daniel's eyes widened slightly, hope flickering despite his attempt to maintain composure. "It would mean a salary," Vanessa continued, "modest but steady, plus reduced rent as part of the compensation package. You'd be responsible for maintenance, tenant relations, emergency response, the kind of work you've already proven you can handle." "I'd be good at it," Daniel said quietly. "I care about this building, about the people who live here. It's not just a property to me, it's home." Vanessa nodded, decision crystallizing as she spoke. "I believe you would be. But there would have to be boundaries, professional expectations. This isn't charity, Mr. Cruz. This is business. Fair business, but business nonetheless." "I understand," Daniel replied, and for the first time in months, his voice carried something that sounded almost like hope. "When would you need an answer?" "I need an answer now," Vanessa said with a small smile, "because I need someone who can fix Mrs. Chen's leaky faucet tomorrow morning, and I'm tired of fielding maintenance calls at all hours of the night." Daniel felt something inside him unlock, a tension he'd carried for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without its weight. "Yes," he said simply. "Yes, I accept." As they shook hands, a formal gesture that felt momentous in its simplicity, both could hear the sound of children's laughter from Amara's room,
where Marisol was apparently visiting for an impromptu playdate. "They're going to be so happy," Vanessa said, and Daniel realized she wasn't just talking about their daughters. 6 months later, the building wore its autumn like a comfortable old sweater, familiar, but somehow renewed. The morning sun slanted through the lobby windows, highlighting improvements that had accumulated gradually. Fresh paint where water damage had once marked the walls, new lighting that made the space feel welcoming rather than merely functional, and a bulletin board where neighbors posted everything from babysitting offers to book club announcements. Daniel emerged from the basement utility room, wiping his hands on a rag that had once been pristine, but now bore the honest stains of daily work. His toolbox, once a burden carried from job to uncertain job, had found a permanent home in the building's maintenance closet. The weight on his shoulders had shifted from desperation to responsibility, a burden he carried gladly because it came with stability and purpose. "Morning, Daniel," called Mrs. Chen as she collected her mail. Her voice carried the warmth reserved for neighbors who had proven themselves through action rather than words. "That new faucet you installed is working perfectly, much better than the old one." "Good to hear," Daniel replied, genuinely pleased. Each successful repair felt like a small victory, proof that his value extended beyond his ability to pay rent on time. "Let me know if you have any other issues." The easy familiarity of the exchange would have seemed impossible months ago, when he'd moved through the building like a ghost, haunting spaces he couldn't afford to inhabit. Now he was woven into the fabric of daily life here, his presence as natural and necessary as the building's foundation. Upstairs, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the hallways, a sound that had become as regular as the morning delivery trucks and evening news broadcasts. Marisol and Amara had claimed the third-floor landing as their unofficial kingdom, a neutral territory where imagination could flourish without the constraints of separate apartments or different economic circumstances. "The dragon is approaching the castle," Amara announced dramatically, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had clearly been designated the narrator of their current adventure. "Princess Marisol must use her magical problem-solving powers to save the village." "I cast a spell of understanding," Marisol declared with equal gravity, wielding a cardboard tube like a royal scepter. "The dragon isn't angry, he's just lonely and hungry. We should invite him for dinner instead of fighting him." Daniel paused on the staircase, listening to his daughter's solution with a mixture of pride and recognition. Even in play, she chose compassion over conflict, understanding over fear.
"Same thing sometimes," Mr. Alvarez observed from the doorway, where he'd appeared with the silent skill of someone who'd perfected the art of timely arrivals. The girls had apparently invited him for pancakes too, and he carried a small bouquet of flowers from the building's rooftop garden, another of Daniel's improvements that had started as practical pest control and evolved into a community space. As breakfast preparation continued, Daniel found himself watching the easy interactions around Vanessa's kitchen with wonder that hadn't diminished despite months of similar mornings. Amara and Marisol worked together with the synchronization of sisters, while the adults moved around each other with the comfortable efficiency of people who'd learned each other's rhythms. This wasn't the life he'd planned or the family structure he'd expected, but it was theirs, built from necessity and sustained by choice, grounded in respect rather than obligation. "Poppy," Marisol said suddenly, tugging on his sleeve with the urgency that preceded important announcements, "I figured out why the dragon in our story was lonely." "Oh!" Daniel knelt to her level, giving her his full attention in the way that had become second nature. "He was lonely because he was trying to protect his treasure all by himself," she explained with the logic of someone who'd given the matter a serious thought. "But treasure is better when you share it with people you trust. That's why he wasn't angry anymore when we invited him to dinner." Daniel felt something profound settle in his chest as he listened to his daughter's interpretation of their morning game. She was describing, in the language of 7-year-old wisdom, exactly what he'd learned about pride and community, and the difference between protecting what mattered and sharing it with people who cared. "That's very wise, mi amor," he said softly. "I think you might be right about treasure being better when it's shared." "Of course I'm right," Marisol replied, with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted that problems had solutions if you just thought about them long enough. "Friends make everything better." As the morning sun climbed higher, filling the penthouse kitchen with golden light, Daniel reflected on how completely his understanding of wealth had been transformed. 6 months ago, treasure meant money in the bank and rent paid on time. Now it meant Marisol's laughter echoing through hallways that welcomed rather than merely sheltered them. Neighbors who trusted him with their problems because they knew he cared about solutions, and a place in a community that had grown around shared responsibility rather than individual struggle. The last eviction notice still lived in his desk drawer, not as a reminder of shame, but as evidence of how quickly life could change when pride stepped aside to make room for possibility. Some mornings, he'd look at it and marvel at the man who'd been so afraid of accepting help that he'd nearly lost everything worth having. But mostly he was too busy living the life that had emerged from that moment of surrender, too engaged with fixing Mrs. Rodriguez's cabinet door and helping Mr. Kowalski navigate the new accessibility features and planning the building's first community garden expansion, to spend much time looking backward. The building hummed around them with the quiet satisfaction of a place where people belonged, where problems were shared rather than hidden, where children could grow up believing that adults generally tried to do right by each other. It wasn't perfect, no building full of humans ever could be, but it was home in the truest sense of the word. And on this particular Saturday morning, with pancakes cooking and friends gathered and daughter laughing, Daniel Cruz understood that sometimes the best treasures were the ones you built together, one small act of trust at a time. Outside, the city continued its endless cycle of ambition and struggle, success and failure, dreams deferred and hopes fulfilled. But inside apartment building 847, in the space between foundation and sky, a community had taken root and flourished, proof that dignity and compassion could coexist, that accepting help was sometimes the strongest thing a person could do, and that the most valuable currency was the willingness to care for each other through whatever storms might come. The last dollar had been spent long ago, but the wealth it had purchased, in friendship, in community, and the quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, continued to compound with interest that no bank could calculate and no eviction notice could diminish. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.